The temperature outside Axel Bergstrom's cabin had dropped to -32 degrees Fahrenheit, and he had not stoked his fire in 6 hours. While Sven Dahlberg shivered 300 yards away, feeding logs into his fireplace every 90 minutes just to keep from freezing, Axel slept in warmth generated by 4 tons of river rock that radiated heat through the long Montana night like a stone oven that refused to cool. Before we go further, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if stories about forgotten frontier ingenuity move you the way they move us, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might be the most unbelievable one we've ever covered. The winter of 1862 hit the Montana Territory with a brutality that old trappers still talked about decades later. Temperatures dropped to -30 and stayed there for weeks. Men who had survived 10 winters in the mountains found themselves rationing firewood and wondering if they would see spring. On the night of December 14th, when the mercury fell to -32 degrees, most trappers in the region spent the dark hours feeding their fires and praying for dawn. Axel Bergstrom slept through the night undisturbed. His cabin sat on a ridgeline 50 yards above the nearest creek, an unusual location that had drawn criticism when he built it. Most mountain men constructed their shelters as close to water as possible. Axel had chosen elevation instead, and the cabin he built there looked nothing like standard frontier construction. The most striking feature was the roof. Where other cabins used bark or split wooden shakes, Axel's roof was covered entirely in river rock. Hundreds of smooth, oval stones overlapped like fish scales across the steep pitch, creating a surface that caught snow and reflected moonlight in a pattern that made the structure visible from a mile away. Vertical posts ran along the front wall at regular intervals, supporting the massive weight above. The whole design appeared strange, over-engineered, the product of someone who did not understand that frontier shelters were meant to be built quickly and simply. But inside that cabin, while the temperature outside plummeted to levels that could freeze a man's breath before it left his mouth, Axel slept in genuine warmth. The fire in his stone fireplace had burned down to coals hours earlier. He had not added wood since midnight. Yet the interior temperature held steady near 45 degrees, comfortable enough that condensation formed on the small window rather than frost. 300 yards down the slope, Sven Dahlberg was not sleeping. He crouched before his fireplace, feeding split pine into flames that seemed to produce heat for only a few feet before the cold swallowed it. His cabin was well built by frontier standards, constructed in 6 days the previous summer using techniques every mountain man knew. Notched logs at the corners, moss and mud packed between, gaps, a solid bark roof, a functioning door. It should have kept him alive through winter, and it did, but just barely. Every 90 minutes he woke shivering and added more wood. His water bucket had frozen solid despite sitting 5 feet from the hearth. Frost decorated the interior walls in patterns that would have been beautiful if they were not so terrifying. Sven had heard about Axel's strange cabin, had even visited during construction to mock the Swede's obsessive attention to details that seemed to serve no purpose. The vertical posts looked ridiculous. The months spent hauling river rocks appeared to be the actions of a grief-addled mind. But on this night, burning through firewood at an unsustainable rate, while cold seeped through every gap in his walls, Sven found himself wondering what Axel had understood about staying warm that every other trapper had missed. 3 years earlier, in October of 1859, Axel Bergstrom had not yet learned what he knew about heat. He and Emil Strom were partners that autumn, working trap lines along 2 converging creeks in what would later become southwestern Montana Territory. They had been trapping together for 4 seasons, long enough to develop the rhythm that kept men alive in the wilderness. Emil checked the northern line, Axel the southern, and they met each evening at the cabin they had built the previous spring. The cabin was typical of the era. They had constructed it in 4 days using notched logs at the corners, moss and mud stuffed between gaps, and a bark roof that kept out most of the rain. It had a single door, one small window covered with oiled paper, and a simple stone fireplace that Emil had built using rocks from the creek bed. The structure was adequate for its purpose. It provided shelter from wind and precipitation. That was enough, or so they believed. October that year arrived cold. Most years, serious winter weather held off until late November, giving trappers time to prepare. But on October 19th, the temperature dropped suddenly. By evening, it had reached minus 15 degrees, and both men knew they were experiencing something unusual. They banked the fire carefully before sleep, stacking enough split wood inside to last through the night if needed. The fireplace radiated heat into the small space, and both men settled into their bunks wrapped in wool blankets and beaver pelts. Axel woke near dawn shivering despite his coverings. The fire had died to ash. The cold inside the cabin felt absolute, as if the walls provided no protection at all. He sat up, breath forming clouds, and reached for wood to restart the fire. Then he noticed the silence from Emil's bunk. Emil Strom was dead. He had frozen during the night, 12 feet from the fireplace, beneath adequate blankets, with wood stacked within arm's reach. The water bucket near the door had frozen solid. Frost covered the interior walls in delicate patterns. The cabin's interior temperature could not have been much above 10 degrees despite the fire they had maintained until midnight. Axel built up the fire with shaking hands, not from cold now, but from the realization spreading through his mind. Emil had not died from carelessness. He had not failed to gather firewood or build an adequate fire. He had died because their cabin, built using methods every mountain man knew and trusted, could not hold heat. The moment the fire died, the structure became barely more protective than a tent. All the warmth they had generated escaped within 2 or 3 hours, and the killing cold flooded in to replace it. He buried Emil on a hillside overlooking their trap lines that afternoon. He marked the grave with stones and spent that night alone in the cabin, unable to sleep, watching the fire and understanding that he was alive primarily through luck. The same thing could happen to him any night the fire died and the temperature dropped far enough. The cabin offered shelter from wind and precipitation, but it offered almost nothing against cold. Axel finished the trapping season alone. The work kept his hands busy, but his mind returned constantly to the same question. Why could the cabin not hold heat? He had built dozens of fires in his life, understood how to create warmth, knew which wood burned hottest and longest. But the warmth never lasted. The moment flames died, cold reclaimed the space within hours. He began visiting other trappers' camps as he worked his lines that winter. Each cabin he saw followed the same basic pattern: logs notched at corners, gaps filled with whatever material was available, roofs made from bark or split shakes. Construction times ranged from 4 to 7 days. Speed was considered essential. A man needed shelter quickly, and elaborate construction wasted valuable trapping time. But Axel noticed something else in his visits. Every trapper he spoke with accepted the same winter routine. Wake multiple times each night to feed the fire, burn through enormous quantities of firewood. Except that mornings would be brutally cold until the fire rebuilt heat. Sleep in layers of wool and fur. Keep water near the fire, or it would freeze solid. These were not considered problems to solve, but simply conditions of frontier life. He asked questions that made other trappers look at him strangely. How long after a fire dies does your cabin stay warm? How much firewood do you burn in a winter? Have you ever tried building with stone? The answers were consistent. Cabins lost heat within 2 to 3 hours. Firewood consumption was enormous, often requiring a full cord per month in deep winter. Stone was too heavy, too difficult to work with, unnecessary for a temporary shelter. But Axel kept thinking about a blacksmith's forge he had seen years earlier in Wisconsin. The smith had shown him how stones around the fire stayed hot for hours after the flames died. The man had explained that some materials held heat while others did not. Wood burned and was gone. Stone absorbed heat and released it slowly. Frontier cabins were built entirely from materials that did not hold heat. Thin logs, bark, wooden shakes, all chosen for their light weight and ease of construction. The structures had no thermal mass, no capacity to store the warmth generated by fires. They were barriers against wind, but offered almost nothing against cold. Heat poured out through gaps in chinking, through thin roofs, through any crack or opening. The cabins were sieves for warmth. Most men accepted this as inevitable. Fire was the only heat source, and when fire died, cold returned. But Axel found himself wondering about a different approach. What if the cabin itself could store heat? What if the structure absorbed warmth during the day and released it slowly through the night, the way forged stones did? Other trappers who heard him talking this way assumed grief had affected his thinking. They were kind but dismissive. Axel did not argue, he simply continued working his trap lines and thinking about stone. In the spring of 1860, Axel left the mountains with his winter's catch of beaver pelts. The journey to the nearest settlement took 3 weeks on horseback. Most trappers sold their furs quickly and returned to the wilderness within 2 or 3 days, spending the interim on whiskey and supplies. Axel sold his furs on the first day and then stayed in town for 2 weeks, behaving in ways that struck other mountain men as peculiar. He spent hours watching construction. A warehouse was being built near the river, and Axel observed the carpenters with intense focus. He paid particular attention to how they reinforced the structure to support a slate roof. The builder explained that slate was heavy, far heavier than wooden shakes, and required additional support. Extra beams were added. Rafters were spaced closer together. Vertical posts were installed at intervals to transfer weight directly to the foundation rather than relying solely on walls. Axel asked if he could examine the building's interior once the roof was installed. The foreman agreed, curious about this quiet Swede's interest in construction details. Inside, Axel placed his hand against the wall on a hot afternoon. The interior was noticeably cooler than outside. The foreman explained that stone and brick resisted temperature change. They stayed cool in summer, warm in winter. He visited a stonemason working on a foundation and asked about thermal properties. The mason, pleased to find someone interested in his craft, explained that stone absorbed heat slowly and released it the same way. A stone building, warmed by sun during the day, would stay warm hours into the night. The reverse was also true. Stone kept cool in summer heat. Axel walked through the town studying brick buildings and stone foundations. He noticed that establishments with brick construction maintained more stable interior temperatures than wooden structures. He observed how weight was distributed in buildings designed to support heavy materials. The principles became clear. Mass stored temperature. Weight required structural support. Heavy materials needed careful engineering, but they provided benefits that light materials could not. He thought about Swedish farmhouses from his childhood. Stone walls 2 feet thick. Homes that stayed warm through Scandinavian winters with relatively small fires. His family had taken the warmth for granted, not understanding the physics behind it. But now, watching American builders work with heavy materials, Axel began connecting observations into a coherent understanding. Before leaving town, he purchased supplies that confused the trading post clerk. 40 pounds of square-cut nails, 6 iron brackets, 2 massive iron hinges, each weighing 15 pounds, a roll of heavy canvas, a specialized draw knife for shaping wood. The clerk asked what he was building. Axel said simply that he needed a better cabin. Other trappers saw his purchases and shook their heads. Nails were expensive on the frontier. Iron hardware was heavy to transport. Canvas served no obvious purpose in a trapper's kit. But Axel loaded everything onto his pack horse and headed back into the mountains, his mind filled with calculations about weight, support, and thermal mass. Axel returned to the mountains in late July of 1860 with his unusual supplies and a plan that he shared with no one. He selected a location for his new cabin that immediately drew criticism from other trappers. Instead of building near water, he chose high ground 50 yards above the creek. The site offered visibility in all directions and natural drainage, but it meant hauling water uphill daily. Most mountain men considered this an absurd trade-off. He began with foundation work that standard frontier construction did not include. He dug a shallow trench around the cabin's perimeter and filled it with rocks, creating a level base that would prevent settling. Other trappers who passed by questioned the effort. Cabins did not need foundations. The extra work seemed pointless. Then Axel began hauling river rocks. He walked to the creek bed each morning and selected stones with careful attention to size and shape. He wanted smooth, oval rocks approximately 6 to 10 inches in diameter. Most trappers used whatever trees were convenient for construction. Axel rejected dozens of stones for each one he kept, looking for uniformity that served a purpose only he understood. He built a crude sled from saplings and rawhide and used it to drag loads of 30 to 40 stones up from the creek. Each trip took roughly 2 hours. He made 2 or 3 trips per day when weather permitted. The work was backbreaking, monotonous, and seemingly endless. By August, he had a growing pile of sorted river rocks beside his construction site. By September, the pile had grown large enough that passing trappers stopped to stare. Sven Dahlberg visited in early October and asked directly what Axel was doing with hundreds of rocks. Axel said he was building a cabin. Sven looked at the stones and asked if he meant a cabin or a monument to his dead partner. The comment was not meant cruelly, but it reflected what most men in the region believed. Grief had affected Axel's thinking. By late November, as the first serious snow began falling, Axel had collected approximately 900 to 1,000 stones. The combined weight was somewhere between 4 and 5 tons. He had spent 4 months on this single task, time that could have been used trapping or building a functional shelter. He was still sleeping in a crude lean-to he had constructed in 3 hours. Other trappers openly called him foolish. One suggested he was wasting his life on a project that made no sense. Another said the rocks would be useful for nothing except crushing whatever structure he tried to build beneath them. Sven told him directly that he should abandon the idea and construct a normal cabin before winter made building impossible. Axel listened to all of this without argument. He simply continued sorting his rocks, arranging them by size, and preparing for the construction phase. He knew what he was building. He knew why the weight mattered. And he knew that explaining would be pointless until he could prove it worked. December of 1860 brought weather cold enough to make rock hauling impractical, so Axel began constructing the cabin itself. His first step was unusual enough to generate fresh criticism. Before raising any walls, he set vertical support posts along what would become the front of the structure. He dug holes 3 feet deep, positioned peeled logs 8 to 10 inches in diameter, and packed stones around their bases for stability. The posts extended 7 feet above ground and were spaced 5 to 6 feet apart. Sven Dahlberg rode by during this phase and asked what purpose the posts served. Axel explained that they would support the roof. Sven pointed out that cabin walls supported roofs perfectly well without additional posts. Axel said, "Not this roof." Sven shook his head and rode away, convinced the Swede had lost his mind. The vertical posts were critical to Axel's design. He had calculated that 4 to 5 tons of stone on the roof would create compression forces that horizontal wall logs could not withstand indefinitely. Wood compressed under sustained vertical load. Over months or years, wall logs would deform, creating gaps and eventual structural failure. The vertical posts provided direct load paths from roof to ground, carrying the majority of weight and preventing wall compression. For the walls themselves, Axel selected logs with obsessive care. He rejected any log with significant taper or irregular shape. He wanted uniformity, logs approximately 10 to 12 inches in diameter that would stack with minimal gaps. Where most trappers left bark on logs to save time, Axel stripped every log completely using his draw knife. Each log required hours of work, but the result was smooth wood that fitted together far more precisely than bark-covered timber. The corner construction used traditional notching methods, but Axel extended each log 24 inches past the corners and pinned multiple logs together with iron rods. This created rigid corner assemblies that could not shift or separate under load. Between each log, he applied his special chinking mixture. He had spent 3 days preparing it, boiling pine sap down to resin, mixing it with clay and horsehair to create a compound that was flexible when warm, but hardened into a waterproof seal. He packed this mixture between logs while it was still pliable. As it dried, it created bonds to the wood that were far stronger than traditional moss and mud chinking. The wall construction took 7 weeks, vastly longer than the 4 to 6 days most trappers required. But when Axel finished in late February of 1861, the walls were nearly airtight. Gaps between logs were minimal. The chinking was solid. The corner joints were rigid, and the vertical posts stood ready to accept weight that would have crushed a standard cabin structure. Sven visited again as Axel prepared to begin roof construction. He examined the overbuilt walls and excessive posts and asked again what Axel was planning. Axel pointed to his pile of river rocks and said simply that everything would become clear soon. The roof construction began in early March of 1861 and immediately revealed why Axel had overbuilt everything below it. Where a standard frontier cabin used 6 to 8 light rafters, Axel installed 14 heavy ones. Each rafter was 8 to 10 inches in diameter, carefully selected for straightness and strength. He spaced them 18 inches apart rather than the typical 36 inches. The result was a rafter system capable of supporting weight that would have collapsed normal construction. The ridge beam was equally excessive. Axel chose a massive log, 15 inches in diameter, and notched it carefully to rest on the gable ends. Lifting it into position alone required a complex system of ropes and leverage that took him an entire day to devise and execute. But once in place, the ridge beam provided a foundation for the rafters that would not sag under extreme loads. Across the rafters, he laid split planks that he had hewn flat on one side. The planks overlapped like shingles, each one covering gaps in the layer below. He pegged each plank to the rafters using wooden pins he had whittled during evening hours. The work was meticulous and time-consuming. A standard roof deck could be completed in a day. Axel's took 2 weeks. Over the planks, he laid birch bark in multiple overlapping layers. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible, ideal for creating a moisture barrier. He covered the entire roof surface, ensuring that each piece overlapped the one below it by at least 6 inches. This would be the primary waterproofing layer, protecting the structure from rain and snowmelt. Before placing stones, Axel built his chimney. He constructed it from brick using clay mortar, positioning it at the peak of the roof in the exact center of the structure. The placement was deliberate. As hot exhaust gases rose through the chimney, they would warm the stone mass from below before escaping. The chimney would transfer heat that would otherwise be lost directly into the thermal mass of the roof. He tested the completed framework by climbing onto the roof and walking across it. The structure flexed minimally under his weight. The rafters were solid. The planking held firm. Everything was ready for the weight it was designed to carry. Sven visited as Axel prepared to begin placing stones. He looked at the overbuilt rafter system and asked if Axel was planning to store his entire winter's supply of furs in the roof space. Axel pointed to the pile of river rocks and said he was planning something heavier than furs. Sven studied the stones, then looked at the roof structure, and his expression shifted from mockery to something closer to concern. He asked if Axel truly intended to put tons of rock on top of the cabin. Axel said that was exactly his intention. Sven told him the structure would collapse within a month, and that he hoped Axel would not be inside when it happened. Axel thanked him for the concern and began carrying the first stones up to the roof. The stone placement began in late March of 1861 and continued through April into early May. Axel started at the eaves and worked upward in horizontal courses, each row overlapping the gaps in the row below. The pattern mimicked traditional slate roofing, with each stone positioned to shed water downward from course to course while maintaining contact with surrounding stones for thermal continuity. He spread a thin layer of clay over the birch bark before placing each stone. The clay provided friction to prevent shifting and filled small gaps between irregular rocks. Each stone was tilted slightly backward, so water would run down its face to the stone below rather than pooling. The angle had to be precise enough for drainage, but not so steep that stones would slide off over time. The physical work was brutal. Axel stood on the steep roof slope for hours each day, lifting 10-pound stones overhead repeatedly. His hands developed calluses on top of existing calluses. His back ached constantly. Progress was slow, approximately 4 to 6 stones per hour, and he needed to place nearly 900 of them. By mid-April, the roof had accumulated over 2 tons of stone, and the structure showed no signs of stress. The vertical posts were performing exactly as Axel had calculated. The walls remained stable. The rafters held firm. Sven visited during this phase and admitted surprise that the cabin had not collapsed. He still believed it would fail eventually, but his mockery had shifted to cautious curiosity. As Axel worked upward toward the ridge, the weight continued increasing. 3 tons, 4 tons. The final course at the peak required smaller stones carefully fitted and sealed with extra clay. When he placed the last stone in early May, the roof held approximately 4.5 tons of river rock distributed across roughly 400 square feet of surface area. The completed roof looked unlike anything else in the territory. The overlapping stones created a scaled pattern that caught light and shadow. Snow would accumulate in the textured surface, providing additional insulation. Rain would shed efficiently from stone to stone, and, most importantly, the massive thermal mass would absorb and store heat in ways that bark or wooden shakes never could. Axel completed the remaining details over the following 2 weeks. He installed a small window high on one wall, covering it with a shutter and his canvas resin composite for insulation. He built a door from thick planks reinforced with iron brackets, mounting it on the heavy hinges he had purchased and installing dual locking beams. He constructed a sleeping platform, shelves, and a small table inside. The total construction time from foundation to completion was 9 months. A standard frontier cabin required 4 to 7 days. But when Axel moved his supplies into the finished structure in late May of 1861, he had built something that no other trapper in the region possessed. He had built a cabin that could store heat. Whether it would work as he envisioned remained to be tested. The first winter in the stone-roofed cabin taught Axel that his calculations had been correct. On cold nights, he built a large fire in the evening and watched the stone roof absorb heat for hours. The rocks directly above the fireplace warmed first, then heat spread outward through the mass. When he banked the fire at midnight, the cabin stayed comfortably warm for 8 to 10 hours, far longer than any frontier cabin he had experienced. But the true test came in December of 1862, when temperatures dropped to -32 degrees and stayed there for 3 days. This was the cold that killed men, the cold that found every weakness in construction, the cold that made survival an active struggle rather than a passive condition. Sven Dahlberg experienced that cold in his well-built but conventional cabin 300 yards from Axel's Ridge. He woke every 90 minutes through each night to feed his fire. Despite constant effort, his water bucket froze solid. Frost covered his interior walls. He burned through a week's supply of firewood in 2 days. The cabin's interior temperature never rose above 20 degrees, even with the fire burning hot. When the fire died down between stoking sessions, The temperature dropped to near zero within an hour. On the second night, Sven genuinely wondered if he would survive until spring. The cold was relentless. His firewood supply was depleting at an alarming rate. His hands were raw from splitting frozen wood. He was exhausted from interrupted sleep and constant fire tending. This was how men died in the mountains, not from single catastrophic events, but from accumulated exhaustion and depleting resources during extended cold. On the third morning, desperate for human contact and half convinced he would find Axel frozen, Sven climbed the ridge to check on his neighbor. He expected to find the cabin dark and cold, possibly to find Axel in the same condition Emil Strom had been 3 years earlier. Instead, he found Axel eating breakfast in a warm cabin. The fire had burned down to coals. Axel had not added wood since the previous midnight, more than 6 hours earlier. Yet the interior was genuinely warm, warm enough that Sven felt the difference immediately upon entering. Axel's water bucket sat unfrozen. No frost decorated the walls. The cabin temperature was perhaps 45 degrees, incomprehensibly warm given the conditions outside. Sven stood in the doorway, feeling the warmth, and asked how this was possible. Axel gestured to the roof above them. He explained that the stones had absorbed heat from the evening fire and were now releasing it slowly. He placed Sven's hand against the interior ceiling near the chimney. The wood was noticeably warm to the touch despite no fire burning below. The stone roof was functioning exactly as Axel had designed it to function. It was a heat battery, storing thermal energy and releasing it gradually over hours. The 4 tons of rock held enough heat to maintain comfortable temperatures through the coldest night the mountains could deliver. Sven stood in that warm cabin and understood that everything he had believed about frontier construction was incomplete. Spring of 1862 brought Sven Dahlberg back to Axel's cabin with questions about construction. He wanted to know about post placement, rafter spacing, stone selection, and the clay mixture Axel had used for chinking. Axel shared every detail freely. He was not trying to keep secrets or profit from his innovation. He was trying to stay alive, and if others could benefit from what he had learned, that was acceptable. Sven built his own stone-roofed cabin that summer. The construction took him 5 months working alone, and the result was not as refined as Axel's original, but the principle was sound. When winter came, Sven's new cabin held heat the way Axel's did. Word spread through the scattered trapping community. Other men visited to see the structures and ask questions. Some remained skeptical, unwilling to invest months of labor in construction. But others, particularly those who had experienced close calls with cold or who had families to protect, began building variations of what the community started calling Bergstrom roofs. Over the following years, the technique spread. Some trappers used flat stones instead of river rocks. Others adjusted the design based on available materials and personal skill. But the core principle remained consistent. Thermal mass in the roof stored heat and released it slowly, maintaining interior temperatures far longer than conventional construction allowed. The cabins lasted longer too, 20 to 30 years before requiring major repairs compared to 3 to 5 years for standard builds. Lives were saved, though exact numbers were impossible to document. A trapper survived a 3-day blizzard with only a single day's firewood because his cabin retained enough heat to keep him alive. A family with young children maintained safe temperatures through nights without constant fire tending. An old man who could no longer wake multiple times nightly to stoke flames lived comfortably in a cabin that held warmth until morning. Axel continued trapping until 1868, then left the mountains for Oregon Territory. He bought a small farm, married a widow with 2 children, and lived quietly until his death in 1891 at age 63. His obituary in the Salem newspaper made no mention of his years in Montana or the cabin innovation that had saved lives. To his family and neighbors in Oregon, he was simply a former trapper who had become a moderately successful farmer. But in the mountains of Montana and Wyoming, Stone-roofed cabins still stood. Some were abandoned, weathered, but structurally sound after decades. Others remained occupied by new generations who benefited from construction techniques they had not invented and often did not fully understand. The stones were still there, still absorbing heat during the day and releasing it through cold nights, still performing the function Axel Bergstrom had designed them to perform. The innovation had outlasted its creator. The principle had proven more durable than the man. And somewhere on a Montana ridgeline, a cabin with a stone roof still kept the cold at bay. Silent testament to what one trapper had understood about survival when grief taught him to question everything he thought he knew about staying warm.